It's wonderful to see folks in a room again. Welcome here. This is the 2022-2023 Bechtel Lecture in Anabaptists and Mennonite Studies, this year presented by Mark Loudon on the topic Reconstructing Linguistic History, What Did Ontario's Earliest Amish Speak? My name is David Neufeld, Assistant Professor of History and Director of the Institute of Anabaptist and Mennonite Studies here at Grable, and I welcome you here on behalf of the college. I acknowledge that we here at Conrad Grable are living and working on the traditional territories of the variety of Indigenous peoples, the Attawandaron, Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee. The first Mennonite settlers arrived in what is today Waterloo region in the early 1800s, less than 20 years after the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784 that granted this land 6 miles on each side of the Grand River from end to end to the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Six Nations. Dr. Loudon's visit this fall has coincided with a series of events marking the arrival in this region of those from another branch of the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition. In 1822, representatives of the Amish first negotiated a land deal with the government of Upper Canada to open Wilmot Township for settlement. This fall, a number of partners have organized a series of events marking this 200th anniversary of settlers' arrival. And alongside bus tours, hymn sings, a series of public lectures, these acts of commemoration have incorporated learning and reflection on the role of settlement in much broader histories of displacement and forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples in this broader territory and nation. So in the same spirit, we encourage you to continue to learn about the land where you live, its history and its peoples, and to take action in advancement of reconciliation. The Bechtel Lectureship in Anabaptist and Mennonite Studies was launched more than 2 decades ago, when local businessman Lester Bechtel reached out to the college and asked how he might support community engagement with elements of Anabaptist and Mennonite history, ideas, and life. And over the years, we've hosted a remarkable group of scholars speaking to a rich variety of topics, from history to literature, from film to theology to music. And during the last years, we've gathered virtually. In 2021, singer Diana Braithwaite and sociologist Timothy Epp offered insight into elements of Black history in our broader region and in Mennonite community life in the 20th century. Last spring, we heard from the writer Sophia Samatar as she explored the implications of sheltering in place in the midst of a pandemic. This year, we're thrilled to be able to gather again here in this room, but realize that we do so without Lester Bechtel himself. We're so grateful to his family for your continuing support of this lecture series, which offers us the opportunity to learn more about Anabaptists and Mennonites through time and around the world. So just briefly, a few kind of indications of upcoming events that might be of interest, highlighting some of the stuff that's already in your program. Most immediately, on Saturday, Dr. Loudon will be elaborating on the work he presents tonight in Tavistock. Saturday at 1:30, you're invited to Tavistock Mennonite Church for this event. If you want more details, you could speak to Fred Lichty. Is Fred here? There he is. Okay. Well, he's here if you want more details. Here at Grable, on November 24th at 7:30 p.m., Dr. Kate Kennedy Steiner will be presenting this year's EB lecture on the topic Music, Liturgy, and the Making of Medieval Scotland. You can find further information about how to attend and register for this event. Less than a week later, on Tuesday, November 28th at 7 p.m., we're hosting a launch for a book entitled Resistance: Confronting Violence, Power, and Abuse within Peace Churches, co-edited by our faculty member, Dr. Carol Penner. This will be a virtual presentation that will also require registration. All these events, including the lecture tonight, require significant support, and I'd like to give special thanks to Birgit Wyszynski and Margaret Gissing for their help making all of this possible. Also for thanks to Marlene Epp and Troy Osborne, who initially were in contact with our speaker. For those interested who aren't here tonight, you can spread the word. This presentation will be recorded and posted on Grayble's YouTube channel. So if you're not taking notes, you can always revisit it, what you learned here tonight then. We also invite you after the lecture and question period to wander upstairs and join us for a reception in the atrium. So finally, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Mark Loudon, our lecturer this evening. Dr. Loudon is the Alfred L. Shoemaker, J. William Fry, and Don Yoder Professor of German Linguistics in the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he also directs the Max Cade Institute for German American Studies. His research explores formal linguistic elements and histories of minority Germanic languages, with a special focus on Pennsylvania Dutch, of which he is the foremost academic specialist. And Dr. Loudon is prolific, the author of dozens of scholarly articles and the landmark and award-winning 2016 book, Pennsylvania Dutch, The Story of an American Language, published with Johns Hopkins University Press. In this work, Dr. Loudon exhibits the scholarly creativity and engaging presentation of findings to which I'm sure will be treated tonight. His writing also transmits to the reader his commitment not only to the study of this language, but also to those individuals and communities who use this language. And in conversation over the last days, it's been fascinating to hear about Dr. Loudon's own experience accompanying and living within Plain communities. His dedication to the language and its speakers is reflected in a long record of public outreach related to the language, faiths, and cultures of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers. Accessible in its majority through his website, padutch.net, in the form of radio interviews, blog posts, and op-eds. Fluent in Pennsylvania Dutch himself, Dr. Loudon also serves as an interpreter and cultural mediator for speakers of the language needing to navigate complicated and often fraught interactions with legal and health care systems. And faculty and staff here at Grable are eager to hear his presentation on healing practices in Plain communities at tomorrow's faculty forum. That's enough to give you a sense of the privilege that it is to welcome Dr. Loudon here. We're very much looking forward to your presentation. Thanks so much for being here.
All right, do a sound check here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Canaries in the back there. All right, good. I want to begin with some words of gratitude. I'm deeply grateful to the late Lester Bechtel, who established these lectures in Anabaptist Mennonite studies here at Grable. I also want to thank Marlene Epp, the former director of the Institute for Anabaptist and Mennonite Studies, who first extended the invitation for me to speak here, and to Dean Troy Osborne, and to Marlene's successor, David Neufeld, who followed up with the planning after Marlene retired. Many thanks also to Birgit Nosinski for her wonderful work in preparing the details of my itinerary. Thank you, Birgit. My visit to Grable in the Waterloo area has been great so far, and I'm really excited about the next couple of days. This is a real treat for me. I want to express some special thanks to Fred Lichty, who got me going on what has become a fascinating research project, some of the fruits of which I will be sharing this evening. About a year and a half ago, Fred emailed me with the following question. I could ask him to read it out loud, but I'll do it here because he's got a mask on. This is Fred's question in an email to me. How do you account for the fact that my ancestors, who came to Ontario directly from Europe, most not even from the Palatinate, speak a Deutsch which is almost identical to the Pennsylvania Dutch spoken by the Pennsylvania Mennonites of Elmira? Fred grew up in the East Zorra-Tavistock area, the descendant of Amish Mennonite immigrants to Ontario, southern Ontario, 2 centuries ago. As he indicated in his email, he speaks a language that is very similar to what is spoken by Mennonites, mostly old orders, in this area. On behalf of the Tavistock and District Historical Society, Fred initiated the V. Gates Tavistock Project and has so far conducted video interviews with, I believe, some 25 or so of the remaining speakers of what I'll be calling this evening Wilmot Tavistock Deutsch. Fred's question stems from the fact that historically, his ancestors and those of the Kitchener-Waterloo area Mennonites comprised 2 distinct groups. Southern Ontario's first Amish Mennonites came directly from Europe, while the Mennonites of Elmira, St. Jacobs, and other communities are descended from immigrants from Pennsylvania, whose ancestors had come to America some 100 years prior. Ontario's Pennsylvania Mennonites speak a variety of Pennsylvania Dutch, the mother tongue of most Amish and Old Order Mennonites in the US and elsewhere in Canada. Rephrasing Fred's question somewhat, what did Ontario's early Amish speak? What is Wilmot, and to be fair to our friends from East Zorra, Wilmot East Zorra-Tavistock Deutsch, and how does it resemble Pennsylvania Dutch? And how does this question relate to Anabaptist linguistic history more broadly? My talk this evening centers on answers to these questions. On this slide, you see the major topics I will be covering. Having already shared with you Fred's question, I will begin with an overview of the key periods of Swiss and Southern German Anabaptist migration history, then let you hear what Wilmot Tavistock Deutsch and Kitchener-Waterloo Pennsylvania Dutch sound like, and say a little bit about similarities and differences between the 2 languages. I will then take you to German-speaking Central Europe, specifically the Palatinate region, which in German is referred to as the Pfalz, from which Pennsylvania Dutch derives, and say something about the historical Anabaptist presence there, and also consider how Palatine German dialects, so the German dialects that are spoken in the Palatinate, differ from what is spoken in other areas, notably in Alsace, Switzerland, Bavaria, and a region that's known as Waldeck, which is located in the modern-day state of Hesse in Germany. I'll be referring to as Waldeck. I will then guide you through some linguistic weeds and share some crucial details about the sounds of Palatine German, Wilmot Tavistock Deutsch, and Kitchener-Waterloo and U.S. varieties of Pennsylvania Dutch. Finally, I'll wrap things up by revisiting Fred's question and offering some concluding thoughts. Broadly speaking, Swiss, South German Anabaptists came to North America in 2 major waves about 100 years apart. The first, who were mostly Amish, Mennonites, and a small number of Amish, migrated to Pennsylvania before the American Revolution. 1 or 2 generations later, Pennsylvania Mennonites, many of whom had loyalist sympathies, began settling in what was then Upper Canada, concentrated in what is today eastern Waterloo County. Not long thereafter, Amish Mennonites from mostly Alsace, Bavaria, and Waldeck arrived and established communities in what became known as the German Bloc in southwestern Waterloo County, eventually moving westward into Perth County. The first Amish arrival was Christian Nafziger, who traveled from his home in Bavaria in 1822 and with the help of Waterloo Mennonites arranged for the purchase of the German Bloc. He returned to Europe and on his way back home may have met with King George IV, or at least the Duke of York, to confirm his purchase. In 1824, Amish Mennonite settlers began arriving and founded the Wilmot settlement, which eventually consisted of the Steinman and St. Agatha congregations. As their numbers increased, Wilmot Amish moved west to East Zorra in 1837, from which the Tavistock congregation came into being informally in 1942. The Wilmot settlement was also the source for other early Amish communities, including Hay in Huron County in 1848, Wellesley in Waterloo County in 1859, and Mornington in Perth County in 1874. The modern Old Order Amish settlement at Milverton, which is Canada's oldest, descends from the Mornington community. At roughly the same time that Amish Mennonites migrated to Ontario from Europe, others, mostly from Alsace and elsewhere in France, came to Ohio and Indiana. Many of these people who are known as Swiss Amish today, so-called not because they came directly from Switzerland, but because of their roots, merged with their Pennsylvania Dutch-speaking brethren already in the U.S. But some of their descendants have maintained a distinct identity among today's Old Order Amish in the United States. Concentrated in Adams and Allen counties in Indiana, they still speak forms of Bernese, Swiss, and Alsatian German. So I'll show a few maps here. Always nice to have pretty pictures. So we know where we are in southern Ontario, but just to give you a sense of the location of Pennsylvania, you can maybe just make it out there that ellipse, that white ellipse, that's basically where Pennsylvania Dutch started. So if you want to look for sort of like the absolute roots of Pennsylvania Dutch in the early 18th century, you would go to Berks County, Pennsylvania, and then southwest to Lancaster, and then northeast to Lehigh counties. And then we'll kind of zoom in on, here we are in southern Ontario. We've got Waterloo and Perth counties there, which is obviously the core of the historical settlement. And then we'll look at a little bit closer here. This is taken from the Global Anabaptist Mennonite Encyclopedia Online, Cameo, that you can just make out here. This is a map of Waterloo County, and those three circles there represent the four clusters that we got: Wilmot, St. Agatha, Steinman, and then East Zorra and Tavistock down there in the lower left corner. But notice that I've drawn a red line there, and that red line basically shows where the division between the Pennsylvania Mennonite area of settlement and the Amish Mennonite areas, right? So a little bit farther to the west. And I didn't have to do much. I didn't have to do any kind of squiggling of the line. I could just basically kind of draw it from north to south there. And we can just zero in a little bit more and see just a little bit more clearly the places that we're talking about. I'm going to just also, for those of you I mentioned, those of you who may be familiar with Indiana, where Allen and Adams counties are, they're located in the northeastern part of the state, where that ellipse is there and zoomed in there. So those of you that are familiar with the Old Order Amish and Elkhart and LaGrange counties, that's just a little bit farther north. So it's not that far away. But linguistically and culturally, they're actually quite different. They yodel, they make their own beer, and very, very interesting folks. Now, I'm going to take a small detour here. I got to take advantage of the fact my first time in Kitchener-Waterloo, and I got to share a story. There's like so many cool things that kind of come together, but it is connected with the thread of my talk. Is Reg Good here by any chance this evening? Okay. This is a story I heard from Reg, who was some years ago at a conference down in Philly. And he's a descendant of Pennsylvania Mennonite migrants to this area, so like the older settlement. And this story, I think, shows nicely the legacy of his ancestors' loyalist sympathies. Reg told me that when the 7th Mennonite World Conference was held here in Kitchener-Waterloo in 1962, the year I was born, one evening the lights in the assembly hall dimmed with a spotlight trained on a portrait of Queen Elizabeth, as we know just passed away, and she was my 19th cousin. The Canadian, nothing removed. The Canadian delegates all stood up and sang God Save the Queen, which gave other attendees pause. Was this not a violation of the traditional Anabaptist Two Kingdoms theology? No, not in the view of the Canadians. They saw a fundamental difference between a hereditary monarch and an elected political leader like the Prime Minister. What the Canadians did in their view was in line with the Two Kingdoms doctrine. Singing O Canada would not have been appropriate, but God Save the Queen was. After a short internet search, I found this image held by the archives upstairs here at Grable, showing the assembly hall with the Queen's portrait prominently displayed front and center. If you're able to see it a little bit better, you see that on the banner, it's bilingual. It's actually English and German. All right, are you ready to listen to some sound examples? Okay, I'm going to give you a short sample of Wilmot Tavistock Deutsch, and then Kitchener-Waterloo, Pennsylvania Dutch, and I will be providing English translations. The Wilmot-Tavistock clip is from one of Fred's amazing interviews that he did last year for the V. Gates Tavistock project. And we'll listen to this, and I'll make sure that the volume is okay.
So, hallo, wie bist du heute?
Ja, ich bin ziemlich gut heute, ja.
So ein schöner Sommertag.
Wundervoll, wundervoll. Ja. Ich kann es nicht besser machen, wenn ich selber gewählt habe.
Du bist so halb im Sommer da rum.
Ja, es leert so about alle anderen Tag und draußen in der Wasser und dann ist es gut.
Ja. Und hast du da ein Stück vom Garten da?
Nee, ich tue nicht die Gartenpflanzen, weil mein Buckel gleicht nicht so. Was ich immer schon. Das ist eine harte Arbeit.
Ja, du hast genug Garten gepflanzt.
Ich habe einen großen Garten gehabt, ja. Gräser wie Sell.
Gräser wie Sell.
Ja, oh ja.
So, ich sehe erst die Frage, was dein Name ist.
Oh, well, mein Name ist Joyce Elaine Sayre. Ich war also schon mal, jetzt bin ich in Sayre.
Ja. Und wann warst du geboren und wo warst du geboren?
Then ich remember that wo ich geboren war, but I remember that was happened that I was born in 1940, April 22nd. Und ich war wahrscheinlich daheim geboren. Und wahrscheinlich war es Susie Sayre, Dr. Hilfe. Mir geht es jetzt ein PSW-Käse, aber da haben sie es Susie Käse. Aber es war immer, wir haben viele Kinder, meine Mama hat viele Kinder gehabt und ich remember, als wir nicht wussten, dass sie ein Baby haben geht, aber wenn wir runtergekommen sind in der Mäue, dann die Steppe runter und Susie war im Pantry und dann haben wir ausgefigert, dass die Mama war im Bett mit einem neues Baby.
So that's a nice sample of Wilmot-Tavistock Dyche. We will now hear two short excerpts from an interview made by dialectologists from Germany in 1969 with a gentleman named Ben Sauter. Does that name ring any bells for folks? Ben Sauter. He was the most well-known Pennsylvania Dutch-speaking Mennonite poet from Ontario. Sauter was born in 1898 and lived most of his life in St. Jacobs, where he passed away in 1979.
Ja, das erste Weg, und wir haben, in meinem Fall, ich war selbstständige Familie, es waren 6, was aufgewachsen sind. Und ich habe selber 7 Kinder und ich habe alle gelernt Deutsch, schwätze so besser geworden Deutsch. Aber neben von der englischen Weile gehört. Und die Großkinder sind noch ein paar, was noch Deutsch kennen, aber nicht mehr viel. Und ich habe, ich vergesse als zwischen 20 und 30. Bei der Zeit, wenn ich als wenig habe trägt, dann gibt es also wieder eins so vor. Aber wir vieles verstehen, wir haben nicht eine Frau durch Schweizer, das ist meine zweite Frau jetzt und mir Schweizer und meine alte Schwester ist da. Wir sind aber ganz fest von der Deutsch in unserer Stadt Almeire. Almeira, sagt man so, aber wir sind als Almeire.
There's one other short example here.
Nur war einer, der Mensch war ziemlich gut. Da war es in der Stadt, wo ein Policeman den Traffic geguardet hat, geguardet fast. Und da war noch kein Rotlicht abgesetzt und so ist so. Vielleicht eine Mittagsstunde, auf jeden Fall abends, nur das gesagt, Children Crossing. Und auf einmal hat er gesagt, Pedestrians Crossing. Nur der wann kommt der Minister ihrer Zeit? Ja, der Presbyterian, Pedestrian, das soll nicht schlecht sein. So muss man nicht dasselbe reden, und hätten sich ziemlich gut genug für Englisch wischen. Aber wir sind so wie so ein Kerl, wir können gar nicht verkaufen in Englisch wischen.
All right, so let's get into some linguistic weeds here. Comparing the linguistic features of Wilmot-Tavistock Dyche in Kitchener-Waterloo, Pennsylvania Dutch, we can make 3 major observations. First, Wilmot-Tavistock Dyche, Kitchener-Waterloo, Pennsylvania Dutch, and U.S. Pennsylvania Dutch are all highly mutually intelligible with one another. It means that speakers have really no problems understanding one another. It's as similar as Canadian and U.S. American English. The vocabulary and core structures of all three are clearly derived from Palatine German dialects. And Wilmot-Tavistock even has some Palatine features that are not found in Pennsylvania Dutch. For example, the preservation of an R sound like mutter and vader and gorde, you've heard that maybe in another one, at the ends of words, at the ends of syllables, and also the use of the verb to go to mark the future tense. That is something that's never been documented in any variety of Pennsylvania Dutch, and the first time I heard it actually came up in the Joyce Sayre interview, and I thought, I wonder if that's Palatine, and went and looked in the Palatine reference book on this, and it's like, it's absolutely a Palatine German feature. And it's something, but it's not in Pennsylvania Dutch, any variety of Pennsylvania Dutch. So recalling Fred's question, we're left here with somewhat of a puzzle. Why is it that Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch and Kitchener-Waterloo Pennsylvania Dutch are so close to one another if their speakers form separate communities? And why is Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch so similar to Palatine German if the founder population came mostly from Alsace, Bavaria, and Waldeck? Starting with the second question, we need to consider some basic facts about the Palatinate, the historical Anabaptist presence there, and the relationship between Palatine German and the dialects spoken in Alsace, Bavaria, and Waldeck. So this map shows the Palatinate located in south-central western Germany. Green dots mark the location of historical Mennonite congregations. Smaller numbers of Amish lived in the Palatinate too. Historical records indicate that the Anabaptist movement took root there early, likely even before 1525. After the 30 Years' War, which lasted until 1648, there was widespread devastation of the Palatinate, and the region became the leading destination for Swiss Anabaptists fleeing persecution in their homeland. They basically just went up the Rhine River and settled in the Palatinate. Now let's examine the Palatinate from a linguistic perspective. Palatine German is part of what's known as the West Central German dialect group, which is marked in purple on this map. Located at the border between West Central and Upper German. Upper German is colored orange and brown orange here. The two major dialect groups within Upper German are Alemannic, which includes Alsatian, Swabian, and Swiss German. And then the second major group is Bavarian Austrian. So basically most of the dialects of Bavaria and Austria are all closely related to one another. Now this zoomed-in view shows more clearly the location of the Palatinate, Alsace, Swabia, Bavaria, and Waldeck relative to one another. The linguistic border between West Central, so the purple area, and Upper German, that orange-brown area, marks a number of major differences in the sound inventories of Palatine, Alsatian, and Bavarian German. German dialectologists call this the Speyerer Linie, the line of Speyer, due to its location close to the southern Palatine city of Speyer. It is also known as the Apfel-Linie, the apple-apfel line, or the Äppel-Äquator, the apple equator. South of the line, in Alsatian, Bavarian, and southern German dialects, the words for horse, apple, and head all have a pf in them, as in standard German, Pferd, Apfel, and Kopf. The Palatine equivalents preserve an older p sound, so Pferd, Apfel, and Kopf. This linguistic difference is salient not just to dialectologists, but to German speakers themselves, who in 2004 erected a monument on the apple equator that features a short poem exemplifying the differences. You walk over on the other side of the stone, and it's a different dialect zone. I had a similar experience. My mom's from International Falls, Minnesota, which is right on the border with Canada. And I said to I was up visiting my mom and relatives, and I said, want to see how a linguistic border works? And so we went to this island where the U.S.-Canadian border was right there, and I put one foot in Canada, one foot in the United States, and I said, about. Not often that you can stand on a linguistic border. The Canadian-raising border is the U.S.-Canadian border. A second major difference between Palatine and Upper German has to do with vowels, as shown on this map. A little bit hard to see with the colors here. Upper German dialects preserve diphthongs in words like Bruder, for the word for brother, and Lieb, which means dear, while most West Central German dialects have made them long monophthongs, so Bruder and Lieb. Another major difference in vowel systems, this time specifically between Palatine versus Alsatian and Swiss German, has again to do with monophthongs and diphthongs, with Pfälzisch, Palatine German, again being the innovator. The older long vowels oo and e are preserved in Alsatian and Swiss in words like, for example, Hus, meaning house, and Is for ice, while Palatine German has Haus and ice. Turning now briefly to Waldeck, this region straddles the linguistic divide between Low and West Central German. Low in German is like, for example, one of the varieties spoken by the Low German Mennonites, the Russian, Mexican, South American folks. The Amish Mennonites lived in southern Waldeck, where Northern Hessian is spoken. Although Northern Hessian and Palatine German are part of the same general dialect group, West Central German, there are a number of structural differences between the two varieties. When we compare Wilmot Tavistock Dutch and Pennsylvania Dutch with European German dialects, the picture is crystal clear. Both languages are clearly descended from Palatine German and not Alsatian, Swiss, Bavarian, or any other Upper German dialects. They preserve the P in words like Appel and Punt. They have the innovative vowels in words like Bruder, Haus, and Eis, nor do they resemble Northern Hessian German any more than Palatine German already does. One final comment about Palatine German. The region has never itself been internally completely homogeneous. On the contrary, there are plenty of internal subdialects, as this map shows. This is just a tiny area. Look at all the dialect borders here. The major divide is basically an east-west one. Pennsylvania Dutch varieties spoken by Mennonites and Amish, who historically comprised only a small fraction of the total Pennsylvania Dutch-speaking population, are most similar to southeastern Palatine German dialects, where that circle is there. Wilmot Tavistock Dutch patterns exactly the same way. Overlaying the east-west dialect border onto the first map we saw with the locations of historic Anabaptist settlements in the Palatinate, there is not a clear pattern at all to suggest why southeastern Palatine German dialects won out in the speech of North American migrants and their descendants. That's an important question for further investigation. It would be really handy if all the Mennonites and Amish were just concentrated in that area, but that's not true. Now we recall that starting at about the middle of the 17th century, large numbers of Swiss Mennonites and Amish began migrating north into the Palatinate. Indeed, in many places they came to outnumber their older Palatine co-religionists. But rather than imposing their Swiss German dialects on their hosts, or maintaining their heritage language in the generations after migrating to the Palatinate, they ended up shifting from Swiss German to speaking Palatine German. Consider this quote from Delbert Gratz in his book, Bernese Anabaptists and Their American Descendants. The Bernese Anabaptists who moved to the Palatinate and Alsace found themselves speaking the dialect of the region within a generation. But not so with those settling in non-Germanic areas. The Jura settlements, which is sort of north of Canton Bern on the French border, the one in Normandy-Yard, which is in France but close to the Alsatian border, but technically not in Alsace, as well as those made in America prove this fact. We'll be getting back to this in a moment. What Gratz describes about Swiss Anabaptist migration history is an example of what is known as the founder principle in linguistics. Modeled on a key concept from population genetics, the linguistic founder principle basically says that a language of a community is typically determined by the people who first establish it. That would be the founders. Later migrants who join an established linguistic community typically assimilate and shift to the language already spoken there. I call them the joiners. So we've got these two groups, the founders and the joiners. Now in Anabaptist migration history, there are many examples of situations in which migrants, unlike these Swiss exiles who merged with their older Palatine German-speaking communities, founded new colonies, and they're actually called colonies, in which they maintained their heritage language in what are known as speech islands, German literally language islands, Sprachinseln. Palatine migrants to colonial Pennsylvania, Protestants, Anabaptists, and Pietists alike, comprised the Pennsylvania Dutch founder population. They moved to an area where there were no German speakers. There have been English speakers, but there haven't been German speakers there, so they were founders. The daughter settlements established by migrants from southeastern Pennsylvania's Dutch country, including the Mennonites who came to Waterloo County, and dozens of other settlements in the United States, are other examples of founded communities. Similarly, Swiss Amish who moved to non-Germanic France, they were basically living in areas where they're surrounded by French speakers, and then later to Adams County, Indiana, are also Speech Island creating founders, as are essentially all the communities established by Hutterites and Low German speaking Mennonites. And you know, Low German speaking Mennonites call themselves the colony Mennonites, right? We talk about settling colonies. Now it's important to note that the Palatinate region was not only a major source of immigration to it, coming to it, but also moving out, right? Out migration, emigration during the early modern era. And most of these outward migrations from the Palatinate involved Protestants and Anabaptists. On this slide, you see the title page of an important reference work from 1909 on the topic of emigration and the founding of colonies by Palatines in the 18th century, which documents the establishment of Palatine colonies or speech islands in North America, South America, Ireland, Denmark, Spain, Eastern Europe, Russia, and even Algeria. To the right, you see contemporary images of place names in County Carlow, Ireland. This is Palatine there, you can just see that. New York State, the town of New Paltz. There's that P for you, right? They didn't say New Paltz, they said New Paltz, right? Consistent with the dialect. And then in Illinois, anybody that flies in and out of O'Hare will know the city of Palatine, Illinois, right, which is a suburb of Chicago. Now, Palatine colonial settlements were also located within German-speaking, but non-Palatine German-speaking territories, so basically other dialect areas like on that colored map that I showed. Now, this map, or the legacy of Palatine inner German migration is exemplified by the distribution of the family name Pfälzer, which means Palatine, in modern-day Germany. And you'll notice that here's the Palatinate, and those little blue spots there, those are the Kreise, the counties in Germany where people have the name Pfälzer. They're all outside of the Palatinate. Because when they moved, it's like the name Schweitzer, for example. There were really no Schweitzers in Switzerland, but as they moved, they said, where are you from? Oh, we're Schweitzer. Oh, we call you Schweitzer, right? Lots of place names do this, not just Pfälzer. Now, the most well-known Palatine colony within Germany is the community known as Pfalzdorf, literally Palatine village, which still exists today, which is located in northwestern Germany, right on the Dutch border. Pfalzdorfers are the descendants of Reformed and Lutheran Palatines who in the 1740s had intended to emigrate to America. But they were denied entry into the Netherlands and had to remain in what was then Prussia. They ended up forming a social and linguistic island due to the fact that the local population was predominantly Catholic. To this day, most of Pfalzdorf's older residents still speak Pfälzisch after more than 275 years. This image was taken in 2016, and the banner's translation down here is like, who wants to go to America? We're staying in Pfalzdorf. And for 275 years already. If you look closely, a lot of them are dressed up like kind of cowboys. So they kind of like that America connection that sort of, even though they weren't moving to the West, but whatever. Now, the experience of Swiss exiles in the Palatinate is a good example of the inverse of the founder principle at work, as migrants joined existing Anabaptist communities in which a different form of German was spoken and shifted from Swiss to Palatine German, as Grass told us, and relatively quickly, he said, within a generation. Other examples of joiner groups are the ancestors of the Allen County Amish, who migrated from Switzerland to Alsace and switched from Bernese to Alsatian German, in a situation that was parallel to the experience of migrants to the Palatinate. There had been Anabaptists in Alsace in the 16th century, well before the arrival of the Swiss after the 30 Years' War. One prominent example of an old Alsatian Anabaptist community was the Markirch Valley, near the modern town of Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines, which has become famous as the home of Jacob Ammann, the namesake of the Amish. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, there were many Swiss Amish who came to the United States in the 19th century and assimilated to their Pennsylvania Dutch-speaking brethren, rather than, say, Adams or Allen County, Indiana style, forming new speech islands. Many, if not most, Midwestern Amish today trace their ancestry to these 19th century European immigrants. So what about Ontario's Amish Mennonites? Largely ethnic Swiss, their ancestors must have lived long enough in the Palatinate to have shifted from Swiss German to Pfälzisch. But before coming to Canada, they must have lived in speech island communities in Alsace, Bavaria, and Waldeck, Otherwise, they would have come over speaking Alsatian, as the immigrants to Allen County, Indiana did, or Bavarian, or North Hessian. For the Bavarian Amish Mennonites, including Christian Notziger, there is ample documentation of the fact that they did in fact live in a Palatine German-speaking colony. Anabaptists in Bavaria were part of a larger migration of Palatines, Protestants, to Bavaria after 1802, when the Bavarian government basically opened up their kingdom to in-migration of non-Catholics. Right? It was 1802. And they settled them in marginally desirable areas, especially in what's known as the Danube-Moor region, which is located northwest of the city of Munich. As late as the middle of the 20th century, there were still Feltish speakers living there. As for Palatine speech islands in Alsace and Baltic, there is no documentation as of yet. However, it is still the most likely scenario. It is of course possible that the ancestors of Ontario's migrants from Alsace had not lived in the Palatinate prior, but instead moved from Switzerland and joined the existing Palatine speech islands in Alsace. It's possible. That would be the task of mainly probably family historians to confirm or refute. The bottom line, though, is that Ontario's earliest Amish Mennonites, regardless of where they immediately migrated from, were Palatine German speakers. By way of wrapping up this discussion of the Palatinate and Anabaptist migration history, I want to share a quote from Don Yoder. For decades, the leading figure in Pennsylvania Dutch studies at the University of Pennsylvania, on how the joiner experience was not limited to Anabaptist migrants. The Palatine blend was transplanted to Pennsylvania and modified even further. The Swiss, whether Mennonite or Reformed, had Palatinized themselves and their families somewhat before coming on to Pennsylvania. At least the angularities of their Schweizerdeutsch, whether Badendeutsch or Zürichdeutsch, had been rounded off into Palatinate. The children born in the Palatinate, who often immigrated to North America, spoke a Palatinized dialect which formed the basis of Pennsylvania German. Even Swiss family names were changed. For example, the Zurich surname Dandlicher became Dentlinger in the Palatinate and Dendlinger in Pennsylvania. The French Reformed elements, for example, the Bechtel family of Chateau d'Aix in Canton Vaud, who immigrated to Nienfeld in the Pfalz and from there to Pennsylvania in 1726, likewise Palatinized themselves, so that in many cases, by the time they immigrated to Pennsylvania, they had Palatine lives and Palatine speech patterns. Now, speaking of names, a nice example of another Palatinized Swiss name is Sauder. We talked about Ben Sauder before. This is derived from the Swiss name Suter. The Suter to Sauder adaptation is parallel to that vowel change that we talked about, from going from like house to house. And if anybody's ever been to the Sacramento, California area, there's Sutter's Mill. Sutter, where the gold rush started in 1848. Sutter was a Swiss immigrant, and that's Suter. It's the same name, right? So Sauder was clearly Swiss ancestry, but had been Palatinized. His ancestors had been Palatinized. The Palatinization of Swiss migrants is clear, but one unambiguous Helveticism, that's the fancy term for Swiss feature, Helveticism, managed to sneak through and survive in both Amish and Mennonite Pennsylvania Dutch and in Wilmot Tavistock Dutch. And that's the diminutive ending "lie," diminutive making something small or kind of cute, which is common in affectionate speech and speech directed at children. Examples are the word koppeli, little cup, boobly, little boy, maidly, little girl, hamli, calf, little calf, bubbly, baby, many, many more. In Palatine German, there are two different diminutive forms, and as we can see on this slide. And also on this slide. You can see the Palatinate straddling the Hien, Shed, L area. By the way, the origin of the family name Bechtel is the pet form of the Swiss name Bechtold. And if my ancestry research is correct, the Bechtold started in Schleitheim in Switzerland, migrated to the Palatinate, and then the name was made a cutesy form like little Bechtold. And that's what that EL suffix is. This is an example of Palatinization right here. Right? So Swiss ancestry but Palatinized. Now, an example of the Swiss li suffix, li suffix, is familiar to English speakers in this word, right? Which means comes from muas, it's the diphthong in Switzerland, the moose otherwise, which is related to the French word moose, and it's related to the English word mush. So it's something that's mixed together. And like chocolate mousse is kind of spun together too. So it's a little muesli. Now, moving on to the final section of my presentation, I'd like to take you from the moors of Bavaria into some deeper linguistic weeds and talk about how Pennsylvania Dutch differs from Palatine German, and then connect it to Wilmot Tavistock. I'm going to start off by giving you a lesson in basic phonetics, so don't worry, there's not going to be a quiz on this, but can't avoid this here. Now, on this slide, you see the 5 short vowels in Palatine German, Pennsylvania Dutch, and Wilmot Tavistock Dutch. I, E, A, O, U. Their arrangement into this triangle-shaped diagram reflects the position of the tongue when a speaker pronounces them. The middle part of the tongue is raised when saying I and U, lowered somewhat for saying E and O, and completely lowered to say A. You can see a mouth going I, U, E, O, A. Now, when we produce an R sound, trill it, swallow it, whatever you want to do with an R, that has the natural physiological effect of depressing the tongue somewhat to the position where an A is pronounced. So it's basically you're kind of forced to open your mouth a little bit more, which is bringing things down to an A-like sound. Almost like a magnet, R can have the effect of essentially pulling the vowels I, E, O, and U downward. Now, this has happened, there's plenty of examples in the history of English. So, for example, the modern English word course, we pronounce it course, comes from the French word cour. Right, so we've gone from an U sound to an O. Cour to cour, because there's an R following it there. Another example would be, we spell it like sergent, surgeon, but it's pronounced sergeant. And consider also the British pronunciations of words like clerk and derby, Clark and Darby. Right? Originally cleric and derby, right? Same thing. Now, when German dialectologists first began investigating Pennsylvania Dutch, they immediately recognized the kinship of Palatine German, but noted one striking difference, that these short vowels, I, E, O, and U, were all pulled down to A if they occurred before an R, across the board. Although this phenomenon of vowel lowering was documented sporadically here and there in some subdialects of Palatine German, in no single dialect were short vowels lowered completely across the board as they were in Pennsylvania Dutch. So here are a few examples from Pennsylvania Dutch. So the word for church, originally Kirche, Palatine German Kaddish, early Pennsylvania Dutch Kaddish, modern Pennsylvania Dutch in the United States is Kaddish. From the F, Merken, Merke in Palatine German, Marike, Pennsylvania Dutch. Durch, the word for through, Dorsch, Dadich, Pennsylvania Dutch. And the last one, Morgen, Moria, Maria. Now, interestingly, vowel lowering before R is also exemplified in many Anabaptist family names, which I think you'll recognize. For example, the name originally Hirschberger is pronounced in Pennsylvania Dutch as Haschbeil. And in fact, there are many people that have that name that actually spell it Harshbarger. That's one of the alternate spellings of what's normally Hirschberger. That's Haschbeil. So Hirschberger to Haschbeil. Herzler becomes Hatzler in Pennsylvania Dutch. Burkhalter, Barikolder. Kurz, Katz. Horst, Hascht. Bornträger, Wanderer. Take your short vowel, put it before an R, and the magnet pulls it down to an R. Pennsylvania Dutch vowel lowering is an example of what happens when dialects abruptly come into contact with one another in immigration situations. This is known as koineization. Cross-dialectal differences are leveled out, yielding new, simpler, homogeneous forms. While we don't know precisely where in the Palatinate the first German-speaking immigrants to colonial Pennsylvania came from, we do know that they came from across the Palatine German area, meaning that there was a lot of intra-Palatine German dialectal diversity among the Pennsylvania Dutch founder population. And you remember that little map I showed, just all the boundaries in the Palatinate? It's very, very complex for a very small area. Within 2 generations, at the latest by the turn of the 19th century, that diversity was basically eliminated. The best example being this lowering of all these short vowels to ah before r. So the question is now, what has happened, if anything, to short vowels before r in Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch? We might expect it to have less lowering than in Pennsylvania Dutch, because the founder population in southern Ontario was much smaller than in colonial Pennsylvania and less dialectally diverse. It probably came from a very, very similar area. And this is exactly what we find. Although there is clear evidence of lowering, more than in Palatine German, Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch is more conservative, that is more Palatine German-like, than Pennsylvania Dutch in its short vowels. Out of curiosity, I decided also to check if there's any difference between Kitchener-Waterloo Pennsylvania Dutch and its linguistic cousins in the United States. Sure enough, Kitchener-Waterloo Pennsylvania Dutch is slightly more conservative than the US varieties, which is almost certainly due to the fact that it branched off from US Dutch starting in the 1780s. That's when we first started coming up from Pennsylvania, right, the Revolution. And that was at a time when coinization, this leveling out, leveling out of variation, was not complete in the United States. So we thus end up with a continuum of conservatism versus progressivism with respect to these short vowels. Palatine German, the most conservative side, Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch, Kitchener-Waterloo Pennsylvania Dutch, and US Pennsylvania Dutch. And I'm not going to drag you any further into linguistic weeds, but I'm just going to show you a few charts here that show Western Palatine German, Eastern Palatine German words that have these vowels in the R, Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch, Kitchener-Waterloo PA Dutch, and US Pennsylvania Dutch. Green means unshifted. Red means shifted. Okay? And you notice it looks very red on the US side and fairly green. And where you see multiple entries in those boxes, the top one is the most frequent one, and the others are sort of like minority ones. So it's not just like they're in the same kind of distribution. Now this is sort of interesting here because Wilmot-Tavistock does pattern a lot like Pennsylvania Dutch, both the Kitchener-Waterloo and US varieties, but with one big difference. In words like, for example, the words for sausage and word, they preserve the R still. So that's still a Palatinism. So they've lowered the vowel, but they haven't chucked the R yet. So it's varsht and vart, as opposed to vash and vat, is what you get in Kitchener-Waterloo and US Pennsylvania Dutch. Another two charts, and then that'll be it for the charts. This you see again, green means conservative, red means progressive. Nothing to do with politics, obviously. But you see a couple of yellow ones there, that's partial lowering, right? So it's not the original vowel's been lowered, but not all the way to ah. And here, Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch is looking very Palatine, right? These are just simply different environments that the next person would be interested in. Kitchener-Waterloo Dutch is also fairly conservative, but not good old US Pennsylvania Dutch, where it's just basically ah across the board, with very, very little variation. So now we're ready to tie things up. Let's remind ourselves, one more chart. Kaddish, Ferdigte, Mariga, and so forth. Almost no shifting here. And then Kaddish, Ferdigte, Badik, Mariga, Dadish, and Maria, with almost no variation that way. And again, Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch still looking fairly conservative. So let's go back to Fred's question. How do you account for the fact that my ancestors came to Ontario directly from Europe, most not even from the Palatinate, speak a Dutch which is almost identical to the Pennsylvania Dutch spoken by the Pennsylvania Mennonites of Elmira? So in other words, what did Ontario's earliest Amish speak? They spoke a form of Palatine German that prior to the migration to Canada, starting in the 1820s, had been transplanted from the Palatinate to elsewhere in German-speaking Europe, Alsace, Bavaria, and Baltic. It's the only explanation. Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch, which is a direct descendant of what Ontario's early Amish spoke, retains clearly Palatine features. So for example, the P instead of Piat in words like Appel, U and E in words like Bruder and Li, and Au and I in words like Haus and Eis. The Palatine German spoken by Ontario's earliest Amish must have been very similar to what 18th century migrants to Pennsylvania had spoken, since the linguistic descendants of these two varieties, Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch and Pennsylvania Dutch, are so similar to one another, even though the two speech communities remain separate. Compared with US and Kitchener-Waterloo varieties of Pennsylvania Dutch, Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch, despite its strong similarity to Pennsylvania Dutch, still retains more features of Palatine German, so the preservation of the R at the ends of words or syllables, use of the verb to go to mark future tense, and fewer instances of this lowering of short vowels before R. Yet Wilmot-Tavistock Dutch and all Amish and Mennonite varieties of Pennsylvania Dutch despite their Palatinization, have preserved the Swiss ending "ly," a small but precious linguistic inheritance from where the odyssey of Ontario's earliest Amish role began. And that's the end of that. Danke, dank, danke in the three varieties. Thank you for coming.
Dr. Loud has agreed to answer our questions related to his presentation or any other questions you've been sitting on related to Pennsylvania Dutch. This is your chance to fire those off.
She slows.
I'd ask you to keep your questions brief so that give opportunity to others. And I will be walking around with this mic. Maybe you could say your name and then ask the question. We'd like to get us started.
Three quick questions. First, 1962, God Save the Queen. I don't think anyone in Canada was singing "O Canada" in 1962. They were all singing "God Save the Queen" growing up in school. So I actually am not, I'd be cautious about that. I'd also look at land prices in the late 18th century in Upper Canada and Ohio. There might have been a reason why people suddenly loved the king. That'd be the first thing. The second is the word "gel." We were in the Emmental this summer. I learned Dutch in an immersion program as a connect on an old order farm in 1978, where we lived with the family. And I suddenly heard a "gel" in the Emmental, which at least the old orders use a lot. And I wonder if that's another word that carries on.
It's Palatine also.
It's what I heard. So then it would, how to get to the Emmental and Zurich would be my question.
It's throughout southern Germany.
Which then makes me wonder about the porousness of the linguistic borders, because in the world I actually know about further east, these borders are immensely porous. And the last comment I wanted to make was when I'm struck by, in learning Dutch from the old orders in Waterloo County, was that virtually all of the words that I heard, including garden from Fred's, is pronounced very differently, including Bech. What I'm struck by was the Pennsylvania Dutch that I learned in Old Order, which is card-carrying Old Order Mennonite, is even more distinct than what I heard. And so I'm really struck by the difference of what you said between it and Pennsylvania. So thanks all around, it was fascinating.
There's a lot of internal variation within Pennsylvania Dutch. To a certain extent, I mean, basically it's regional and it's church affiliation. So there's like, even in Lancaster County, northern Lancaster County, overwhelmingly older Mennonites, southern Lancaster County Amish, two very different varieties, but completely mutually intelligible. Again, they understand one another, but they just sort of say, oh, you're a Mennonite. I mean, you can hear it right away. There can be even family differences sometimes too. So it's never completely homogeneous. And there's generational differences. Older people sound different from younger people. There's that too. So the question about sort of like similarity between what's spoken in the Emmental and the Palatinate and Bavarian, that sort of thing. Keep in mind that these borders, all borders are porous because there are certain things that are broadly speaking throughout the German-speaking area, including in Low German, right? And there are some things that are only in, say, Central and Southern German, and some things that are only in certain parts of Southern German, and some things that give very specific only. It means like you could be drawing, you know, hundreds of concentric circles, and Gel happens to be one that's pretty widespread. You can go from Eastern Austria to basically the Alsace region, and then fairly far north and central, and you'll hear the word Gel, right? So they are connected in the same way that regional dialects in Canada and the United States are connected to one another. Some things are broadly speaking Canadian. Some things are quite limited to, say, a particular region or township or something like that. So that's consistent with dialect geography, very much so.
My name is Dan. I'm with the Swiss, and from the Alsatian group. And I do find that there are some very delightful influences that I have discovered in the Tavistock, East Zorra thing, and then also by going to Germany myself for almost 4 years of graduate studies. and discovering Schwäbish influences, discovering the little Swiss things like Geisle instead of Ziegen. I had no idea what a Ziegen was when I first got to Germany because I grew up with Geisle. My mother says that she can remember great aunts of hers still speaking French as well as the Dutch when they want to keep secrets from the kids. I'm very sorry that they didn't keep both languages going. That helps for me here.
That's a very interesting piece of evidence, that the fact that her ancestors came from the speech island.
Yes.
Means that they were surrounded by French speakers.
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent.
Anyway, I find dialect absolutely delightful, seeing the things that make it unique and also that bring us together.
Thank you.
English does taking over virtually Germany. At the time, how do these two dialects, how are they coping with the incursion of English?
English doesn't pose as much of a threat as a lot of people fear. There's a lot of vocabulary that have been borrowed, but even still, it's not, the grammar is not affected, the sound system is not affected. So and then there are a lot of things that are English-like but are not English. The word for cell phone, for example, in German is Handy, right? And it's not handy, it's Hindi, right? So it's adapted to the German pronunciation. The word for that thing there, the data projector, in German is called a Beamer. We don't say, when we think of Star Trek, we think of BMWs or something like that. There are lots and lots of words that are vague. Oh, this is a good one too. What I'm wearing here, sweater vest, you know what that's called in German? Pulanda. Pullover is a sweater, and they just came up with Pulanda. So they do have English influence, but they adapt it and then take it in very different ways, right? In the same way that we do with French words and all that sort of stuff too. Now, there's less regional variation, like in traditional dialects in Germany, not because of English, but because of greater mobility. People are moving in different areas, and younger people are marrying folks from outside their area, that sort of thing. And so, in fact, the modern-day German landscape, that dialect map I showed you was basically from before World War II. Today, it's a little bit more muddied, and dialectologists typically refer not so much to dialects as regiolects. So basically sort of regionally inflected speech, but still fairly standard-like. But that has to do with mobility. It has to do with all the population shifts, especially after World War II, and it's not directly related to English influence.
My name is Louis Brubaker, brother-in-law of Eddie Miller, which might prompt something for you. But my question is this. When I heard Ben Souter speaking, and you focus on word pronunciation, but I'm thinking of the flow of speech. There's a sing-songy flow that you hear in Elmira all the time. And I naively think it's related to Switzerland. I hear the same thing in Swiss German. But could you comment on that aspect of Pennsylvania Dutch?
Great question. That's intonation. That's the term. The technical term is intonation. This is also known as sentence melody. It's no more similar to Swiss German than Palatine German is to Swiss German. See, that's the thing. A lot of people say, "Oh, I've been to Switzerland. I've been to Swabia." They say it just Pennsylvania Dutch sounds like that. That's because Palatine German and Swabian, and Palatine German and as Southern German dialects, they share things in common. Go to the Palatinate and listen to varieties, and you'll hear that same sort of melodious speech. What I liked about Ben Souter was that when he pronounced English, you could hear really Dutchy accents, Presbyterian, right? And things like that. I mean, he clearly, Pennsylvania Dutch was his dominant language and it was over his English as well. But the Palatinate is not really on the radar for a lot of people. Like when they travel to Europe or Germans think about dialects, they think Swiss German, Alsatian German, Swabia. In fact, a lot of Amish, you say, well, where does your German come from? They say Swabia, Schwäbisch. And I say, well, Schwäbisch is very similar to Pfälzisch. That's why you see the similarities. But go to the Pfalz. and what they're getting it from is that like, say, German tourists who have come to Pennsylvania and Canada who are familiar with something with Southern German dialects, and some of those that come from Swabia, they say, oh, it sounds like my grandmother talked. Well, Yeah, and so do people from the Platte. That's how your grandmother talked as well. But that's a it's very common for people to hear things in other varieties that in fact are the same Pennsylvania Dutch. But, you know, the bottom line is it in Palatine German as well? And the answer is yes, 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 yes. The only thing that's uniquely Swiss or not Palatine is that the suffix. So, but the intonation is Palatine.
I've seen a couple of your hands. I'm on it. I got a list in my head.
I'm Tom Yoder Neufeld. You've mentioned a good deal about the R and its effect on vowels and so on. I noted from the earliest video you had a very hard R, and that jarred a bit. But is that old, or is that the influence of English existing as another main language alongside that?
Excellent question. The answer is yes and yes, and I'll tell you why. The quality of the R that she pronounced is the Canadian R, the But if you listen to when the R occurs between vowels, like Gibwada, she doesn't say Gibora, she says Gibwada. That's the original one. The unstressed one, which is the Canadian R, was originally just not a trilled one. And it is an influence of Canadian English. And same thing in the United States for those that have R, like in Lancaster County, have American R. And to hear that it sounds very anglicized.
Right.
So the quality is Canadian, the distribution is Canadian and Palatine, because in Canadian you don't say mother and father, you say mother and father. But the old trilled R in Gibwada and Fwada and that kind of thing, as Joyce did, that's original. So that's why it's yes and yes. Great observation.
Hi, my name's Christine Kiefer, and I'm from the Milverton Amish group. One's a comment and one's, I guess, a question. My dad would have gone to a lot of Dutch speaking events in Wellesley Township, and in Wellesley actually. And he would have, I remember him saying that there was a lot of Lutherans and Catholics that also spoke Dutch, which I suppose would have been as much, I don't know, your comments were about the Anabaptist immigration, but I guess just reflecting that probably whole communities up and came from that particular area. And he said, we go and spoke Dutch. It wasn't a uniquely Amish Mennonite thing. And then the second thing is just commenting on the comparison between what I would call Amish German and the North 86. And you say it's quite similar. What I would notice is that when those speakers speak English, they actually have different, what we would say, Dutchy accents. And you can hear it. So my children would have gone to school with a lot of the Dave Martin children. And their English has a different accent than the local Amish English.
Interesting.
And it's curious, I don't know how to explain it, but that would be probably another rabbit hole that we can find travel down.
Yeah, very interesting.
Back to the first question, why do Lutherans and Catholics sound like the Anabaptists? Joiners. It's that founder principle. The Anabaptists were here first. And so even though the Lutheran Catholics, some may have come from the Palatinate, but to the best of my knowledge, they came from areas outside the Palatinate. Within a generation, their descendants had shifted to the local German variety, which was Dutch. It's a great example of that. Fred and I kind of went back and forth about it, and I said, when did the Lutherans and Catholics arrive? After the Anabaptists.
Troy Osborne from the American Amish communities, but not my. Anyhow, this is a broader question than just these local groups, but I know that I did live in the Pfalz, and there was a big effort there at kind of writing down the Mundart and recording it. Is that, maybe just to speak more broadly, what is that effort like in Germany, but also among American and Canadian speakers of this?
So basically, dialects, regiolects, and languages like Pennsylvania Dutch and so forth are predominantly, we'll say, oral vernaculars. It's mainly people speak it, the language, and don't write it. In earlier times, say the Anabaptists were coming over with knowledge of Standard German, then they shifted to English, mainly through educational systems. So your typical linguistic profile of an old order person in the United States and Canada is that they speak Pennsylvania Dutch or Amish Swiss German, whatever, Pennsylvania Dutch, and read and write English as their main sort of like language of literacy. They have what we say receptive or passive reading knowledge of an archaic form of Standard German for devotional purposes, so like the Bible and the Ausbruch and prayer books. There has been tradition among the so-called non-sectarians, the Lutheran and Reformed majority in the United States, in the Dutch country of Pennsylvania, to write Pennsylvania Dutch. And that goes back to the early 19th century. And there are literally thousands and thousands of fantastic texts, most of which appeared in regional local newspapers. There was never any kind of like standardization because everybody just voted the way that they spoke it. In recent times, the Bible has been completely translated into Pennsylvania Dutch, so it's completed in 2013. So in the 90s, the New Testament was finished, and then it took another 20 years or whatever to do the Old Testament. It was produced by a man who's still living, he's in his mid-90s. His name is Hank Hirschberger, who grew up in the Holmes County, Ohio area, and was Amish. I believe he did join the church, but anyway, he left, and then he and his wife joined the Wycliffe Society. They know how to do Bible translation, and it means translating from the original tongues into whatever language they're translating into. The orthography, the spelling system that they use for that is basically English. Now, I've got a copy of the New, not here, but I brought for the reading that I'm going to be doing tomorrow night in Pennsylvania Dutch, I brought a copy of the New Testament. It is, the reason that they selected English spelling is because the idea is to sort of improve old order youth spiritual life health by getting them to read scripture in their native language. And so they say that the most efficient way of doing that is to not to use German orthography, but to use English orthography because of their literacy in English. Now, there's been a little bit of tension or resistance on the part of the old orders to accept this. First of all, because they say, we're doing just fine with German and English. We don't need Pennsylvania Dutch. There's also a suspicion, because these are ex-Amish people that have produced it, that there's maybe some sort of subtext there. And there are rumors that somehow there are things that are evangelical and not Anabaptist, and twists on the translation. And then the real icing on the cake is that the one missionary organization that's really taken this up are the Jehovah's Witnesses. And the Jehovah's Witnesses have a small number of ex-Amish who have joined. To my knowledge, there are no ex-older Mennonites, but I know of like 4 families from the Amish. And they have 2 of them have been enlisted to translate witness tract materials into Pennsylvania Dutch. If you want to hear really good Amish Pennsylvania Dutch, go to jw.org and select under literature, select Pennsylvania Dutch, Pennsylvania German, and they have the texts written in this orthography, and you can hear they have MP3 files as well. So linguistic quality is quite good. And again, it's like when you tell the Amish that Jehovah's Witnesses, okay, forget it, that's it, we're not doing it. So some do. I was actually in Kentucky a few weeks ago in a New Order Amish family, one of my healthcare things, and I was staying with this couple, and we were doing devotions in the morning, and they were using the Pennsylvania Dutch Bible, translation Bible. And I thought that was very sweet. The only time that I've ever seen devotions. It's usually been in German or English, but this time it was in Pennsylvania Dutch. I was very, very interested to see it. And they have a son who's 43 who has a genetic disorder and is severely disabled physically and cognitively, but he's able to read. And this guy can read German, English, Pennsylvania Dutch. We were going in a circle and taking verse by verse through the chapter of scripture, and he held his own reading Pennsylvania Dutch as well.
Other questions?
Anybody, Bruce?
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to apologize to Fred Lukey for this question, but in your research, Mark, have you can you confirm or deny the rumor that Jacob Almond or his family had owned a hooks and eyes factory?
That's a new one. I've got a lot of questions in my day. That is one that I've never heard. No comment.
I actually have a question. You talked about speech islands and various pace of linguistic change. I'm wondering how the pace of linguistic change in Pennsylvania Dutch speech islands compares to the pace of change in speech islands of other minority Germanic language-speaking groups.
Excellent question. There were a lot of Palatines that went to Russia, same westward migration, and so there are Palatine speech islands. They share a lot of features with Pennsylvania, common with Pennsylvania Dutch. Basically, languages of, whether you call them speech islands or simply small, compact, homogeneous communities that don't have any or little or no in-migration or in-marriage, tend to stay more conservative. Best example would be Icelandic. The country of Iceland is essentially a linguistic island, as well as a physical island. It's a place where everybody's related to everybody else, incidentally, right? Literally. It's interesting for genetic purposes, putting on my healthcare hat. It has almost exactly the same population as the older Amish in the United States and Canada, and everybody's related to everybody else. They've been there for 1,000 years. And Icelandic shares a lot in common with Old Norse, right, which was spoken 700 years ago. And so if you look at continental Scandinavia, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish, and that kind of thing, much more rapid change. But when you transplant a group, leave it to its own devices and keep it fairly homogeneous, the rate of change is slow. It's migration and mixing and population mixing that advances the pace of change, which is what we see with this lowering of the exact same process, with the lowering of those vowels. Questions? They're great questions.
My name is Rebecca Yoder-Neufeld. My mother was born and lived in Lorraine, and was, although schooling was in French, the language was a Lothringer dialect, a Germanic dialect. Her father was from Alsace, but when I assisted her with her memoirs, she said that among Mennonites they spoke a different Germanic dialect than either the Lothringer or the Alsatian. They knew the Lothringen dialect, they knew the Alsatian dialect, but what they spoke among Mennonites was different. She didn't describe how it was different, but it was a specific, she called it a Mennonite German dialect. My guess is that's Latin. No,
That's exactly it. We need to connect afterward. That's exactly the smoking gun, basically. Wow, thank you.
Any last question? Yes.
So one other feature that I have picked up on in Tavistock area is that we've dropped the veer and we say mir game. Mir den ebla uf heva. So auf has become uf, and sometimes a V is inserted, sometimes it says V. We wouldn't say auf heben, we'd say uf heva. And ebla instead of ebla.
Well, why don't we thank Mark Loudon again for his presentation. Thanks so much for coming out. It's good to see an engaged audience here in person again, for your support of this event, for your interest. We invite you now to head upstairs for some treats and to continue the conversation. Have a good evening.